make sure that you have a strong cash and a strong accrual lens on your business, that you're regularly paying attention to the sort of vital indicators of health in both of those areas, which we're going to talk about. And then you should know that you have a problem, even if your cash reserve seems fine in a given moment in time. You'll see the problems coming and hopefully be able to prevent them before they cause an issue.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. Joining me again today is the incredible Carson Pierce.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Nice to see you again from our nation's capital.
Yep.
Ranked, according to a person I sat across from at dinner in Montreal, ranked one of the most boring places to live on earth, but you seem to really like it, and I love that for you.
I don't know what that says about me, but yeah, it's been a weekend like wandering through this enormous park, which is great. I guess that's boring, but
to each their own. I mean, I don't know. I feel like we're adults that don't like to party, and so everything that you've told me about the activities you're doing in Ottawa, they sound just lovely to me. So
yeah, we're doing a lot of culture. So I don't know, not a lot of clubbing with my 3-year-old, but a lot of culture.
Yeah, I don't blame you. Just as much sleep deprivation, though, I'm sure.
Pretty much.
So on that note, unrelated completely, we're talking about cash flow today. And this was a topic that you brought up and prepared some notes on, and then I did some prep on as well. I'm really excited to talk about because I think it's super important. It's not something we talk about a lot because we tend to focus on the other sort of side of the coin, which is the unit economics and profitability of the business. But this is an important consideration, and I think the relationship between them is important too. So with all of that, Carson, why don't you tee us up for today? Why talk about cash flow? And what are some of the challenges that you see people struggling with that we're hoping to address on today's episode?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we don't normally do a whole lot of work in this. We don't see it a lot because we're focused on other things. I think the other things are generally more important. But every once in a while it pops up, and it pops up in strange and terrible ways. And I can think of 2 examples on either end of the spectrum. In one case, I had a client that was doing okay in a lot of ways, but their cash flow was really tight. And of course, with the cash flow being tight, it just limited all their other options. And we dug into it a little bit more. They had things like 120-day terms for some of their project work, which basically meant they were acting like a bank for their clients. But yeah, on that end of the spectrum, it just was hurting them so much that anything else wasn't even a focus for them because they had to focus on that one thing. And then I've had the opposite problem. We don't see it a lot because we deal with clients who are struggling, but these are agencies who don't think they're struggling because there's money in the bank. Things are going good. But that will often hide what's really going on, which is they're eroding, poor profitability is just eroding away at that cash in the bank. And over time, it will become a problem. But they just don't see it as an urgent issue at that time. So yeah, both ends of it. And both of them are problematic. But I know when I brought this up to you and we started talking about it as a topic, you kind of lit all up and got super excited about talking about it like we were going to be talking about last night's ball game. But yeah, you're into it. So let's go. What have you got for us here on this?
I have so many things, but I'm going to start with some sort of core concepts and principles I think are important for people to understand. And so the first one is that cash flow and profitability are not the same thing. They're often correlated, but they're not inherently related. And so what I mean by that is it is possible for you to have good cash flow and be unprofitable as a business. And we've seen this before. This is a trap that people can fall into where you could have new clients coming in and they're paying you upfront deposits for projects, and you have enough cash that every month you're not running out of cash. But underneath that, on an accrual basis, the business is fundamentally not making money. And that can go on for actually a very long time. And we've had this experience with clients where they had cash flow problems that were masking profitability problems. And the inverse is also true, where you can have a profitable business that thinks they're not profitable because they're having cash flow issues. And you can be very profitable and still have cash flow issues. And so in some cases, good cash flow can create the illusion of profitability, and poor cash flow can create the illusion of poor profitability. And so these two things are related, but they're not inherently linked. And depending on what your business model looks like, they can look very different at a given period of time. You could be extremely profitable in a month and have horrible cash flow, and the inverse can be true the following month. And so it's very important to be able to measure both of these things separately to have a complete picture of what's going on. So that sort of touches on the second major thing here, which is accrual versus cash lenses on the business, and the utility of those two things, and why you should have both ultimately. And so the big idea here is cash flow is, and cash-based lenses on the business focus on when cash comes in and out of the business. And the reason that this is important is it's sort of like a power grid, where it's like, it doesn't matter that the power grid is only operating at 20% of its capacity 90% of the time, if 10% of the time it maxes out. Because as soon as you peak on the power grid, that's when you have catastrophic impacts. You have blackouts, you have power outages, the hospital doesn't have power, people die, streetlights go out. Like, there are significant negative implications. And in the case of business, you could have a very healthy, profitable business that, just because there's an oversight in cash flow, if you have that month where you peak and you have no cash left, the whole business could become insolvent and go under, right? In a business that otherwise would have been poised for success. And this is especially risky in businesses that are growing very, very fast, because high growth can be very expensive from a cash flow perspective, or a business that has been taking on a lot of leverage in terms of debt. And so while they might be very profitable, they might have a lot of debt service obligations. And so this can be a real challenge. An otherwise healthy business can get itself in really hot water because just 10% of the time they have these cash events that put them at high risk. And so the cash flow lens is all about basically making sure that you're never running out of cash, and that you always have enough cash coming in and going out at the right times to be able to meet all of your financial obligations and do so on time. Whereas the accrual lens on the business is more about paying attention to the fundamentals of the business and making sure that it is fundamentally profitable by balancing when you earn revenue to when you use expenses. And we've talked about this in the past on the podcast. You and I actually just did an episode all about accrual and revenue recognition recently, which we'll leave in the show notes. But that's the sort of fundamental principle between cash and accrual, and how those are related to cash flow and profitability, which are both important but slightly different. We're going to talk a little bit more about that throughout the episode. So I'll start there.
Yeah. I have one question. Something you mentioned in there is about how if you're highly leveraged, that could be a problem in terms of your cash flow. And usually I've seen it go sort of hand in hand. The companies that have cash flow trouble also have a lot of debt that they're paying down. We all know from a personal finance perspective, it's always a good idea to pay down your debt first. Do you have a perspective on that for an agency?
Yes. So, like, generally speaking, if an agency is taking on debt or raising capital, it's usually a bad sign for me. Most professional services firms should not need external capital to scale unless they're doing so at incredible rates, right? Like really, really incredible rates. But generally, they're just basically trying to make up for shitty unit economics that they're not aware of. So like, if you are going to take on debt, then you really want to make sure that you are clear on your unit economics. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But those are the fundamentals of making sure you have good direct delivery margin, you have good delivery margin, you're able to produce EBITDA, and that EBITDA will be enough to service the debt that you're taking on. And so that you don't run into the situation where, and this is very possible, like you could have a profitable business with negative cash flow because your debt service is more than what the business can produce from a profitability perspective. And that shows up in debt service ratio, which is a metric that you could track that helps you understand the cash flow health of the business, which we'll talk a little bit more about. The other thing that you're speaking to is sort of the punishing cost. So we're getting into two of the important considerations here. It's the cost of poor cash flow. And this is one of the most punishing features of this capitalist society that we live in. And it exists both in personal and in business finance, which is essentially like usually the worse your financial situation, the more expensive it is to live. And that shows up in two ways primarily. You generally pay a higher amount for goods because you're not able to buy them in bulk. You also tend to defer to options that require less cash up front, which often are more expensive. So for example, like paying for something monthly is a lot more expensive usually than buying it annually. Right. So deploying less cash is more expensive than deploying more cash. Buying a small jar of peanut butter is usually way more expensive than buying the big jar of peanut butter. And debt tends to be also more expensive. The worse your credit score is, the lighter your balance sheet is, the worse your debt service ratio is, and the shorter term that debt is. So that combination of higher interest rates and then a higher relative input cost could be enough to wipe out what little profit you actually had in the business. And this is a spiral, and it's a trap that people can get caught in. So if you're getting to a place where you're looking to debt or you're looking to these tactics in terms of trying to like defer or spread out payments, and we're going to talk about all the tactics that you can use to improve your cash flow. But if you're looking at those, the important thing to start with is, are the fundamentals of this business good enough to recover from this? Because if not, you could actually just accelerate your path to poor cash flow and eventually insolvency, and in some cases in a way worse place than you otherwise would have been.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember working with one agency where they had turned things around. They're going to be profitable, but they had so much debt that they had to work their way out of first. And that was kind of the priority for them as a first step, is to get back to a healthy place there. All right. All that aside, I know you've built out a whole model around this and have some ideas on what the different levers are. So let's dive right into it.
Yeah, and I'll see if I can maybe make this available in the show notes or something like. But I've got this little thing that I created in Miro. So if you think about the equation for cash flow, right, there's basically two things that you can do to improve cash flow at a high level. They're very simple. Number one, you can speed up the rate at which you collect cash. And number two, you can delay your expenditures or spread your expenditures out. So there's less cash going out. So it's like bring more cash in, have less cash go out, and hopefully align the timing of those two things better. The other thing that you can do, of course, is you can increase your cash reserve so that your tolerance for fluctuations in cash flow is higher, right? So that would kind of like be the idea of the way that you handle higher peak demand in your grid, in your power grid, is you make the entire grid bigger. And then there's also concepts of, and you also create this overflow capacity, which would be in the form of revolving credit, lines of credit, credit cards, those kinds of things, which is a common tactic. So we're going to start with speeding up cash collection, that first side of things, and all the ways that you can do that. And at the end, we'll talk about the trap, the trap that speeding up cash flow can cause you to fall into, which you want to be paying attention to. So, of course, the things that are obvious here is try to improve your payment terms to begin with, right? So if clients are currently paying you net 90, try to get them paying you in 60 or 15 days. And if you are currently getting paid after the work is done, try to get paid before the work gets done. And if you're currently only taking a 25% deposit for the project, try to get paid a 50% deposit for the project. So try to just adjust your baseline payment terms. And even if you don't think that you can get those better payment terms, you might be able to get better payment terms that you have before because the relative anchor in the negotiation is more aggressive, right? And in some cases, you're going to be working with big enterprise companies and you won't be able to get that done. In which case, one thing that can actually work well, even with the enterprise companies, is create incentives for faster payment, right? So for example, hey, you're going to save 5% if you pay us within 30 days on your invoice. So you offer an incentive for them to pay you quicker. The other thing that you can think about is just actual accounts receivable issues. So this might be a thing where, well, the payment terms are good, but they're still late, right? So, okay, we're on net 30, but this client still doesn't pay us until 90 days out because they're always late. So in that case, can you set up auto payments or ACH? Can you do delinquent churn reduction if you have a lot of credit card payments that go through and you're dealing with failed credit cards, right? There's some products out there that can help you retry cards in a smarter way that will help you recover more payments. Do you have, good processes for checking in and follow-ups? Do you have stop work agreements? And if things get too far along, do you have a way that you can basically sell that debt to a collections agency and get something instead of writing off bad debt? The other things that you can pay attention to here are earning your revenue faster. So this assumes that you're in a pricing model where you're either tying your invoicing to time or to deliverables. And so this is an often very overlooked thing. And this is actually really important for when you have poor utilization is, can you pull anything forward? Is there a thing that the deadline is 3 months from now, but like, why don't we just get it done this month if we have the capacity? So anything that you can do to pull work forward and get work done faster so that you can invoice quicker can help you pull cash in quicker. And then the last piece that's related to that, actually, there's two more pieces, is can you change your pricing and packaging? So if right now you're anchoring, for example, your pricing to time and materials, can you instead move it towards abstracted time materials so that instead of waiting until the end of the month and invoicing for the hours that you worked, you charge by the month and you charge upfront for the month, right? So you're charging for time elapsed as opposed to time spent. Can you move to prepayment versus post-payment type models? Same thing for deliverables. And then last but not least, and probably least is invoice factoring, right? So if all of those things fail and you're stuck on these crappy payment terms, there are a lot of companies out there that do what's called invoice factoring, where you issue the invoice and then you can get paid for that invoice immediately. And a lot of payment platforms are actually starting to offer this as a fintech service right inside of their platforms. I know, I think it was Chase Bank, or it might be JP Morgan Chase. They, I think, have this set up now where they offer the factoring directly to people that are being paid through that bank. And they'll take a small percentage as a spread, but pay you instantly. And then they'll collect the payment from the client. Now, that costs you money. Again, like this is, again, one of the costs of having poor cash flow is you might give up an extra 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, in some cases, percent of the invoice, but you get paid right away. So it can solve your cash flow problem. So you could look into factoring if all these other things fail. Just make sure that you can afford it and that you're baking that into your pricing. And what you may do is adjust your pricing so that essentially the incentive for paying early and paying on time is getting you the same amount of money that you otherwise would have gotten if you had to use invoice factoring to solve the cash flow problem. So that's just sort of like a long list of things that you can consider to improve cash flow. And then, of course, pre-sales, which we don't love. That's also a trap. But anything you can do to be selling things ahead of time and collecting money for them, that's going to help you speed up cash collection. So those are some tactics. Did I miss anything, Carson, from your perspective?
No, but there's the inverse of one of the ones. You're talking about like being able to pull work up faster, invoice sooner. What I see a lot of agencies get into the trap of is, for whatever reason, capacity issues, delays, whatever, they very willingly stretch out that timeline. Like, oh, we're going to move that deadline out a month, whatever. And all of that is impacting your cash flow. If you're working on a basis where you don't get paid until the work is done, now you're just pushing your payment out that much further, which is going to hurt you from a cash flow perspective.
Totally. Especially if your team's on salary, you're still paying those salaries. And in some cases that might actually lower your absolute profitability as well. So yeah. Now, I talked about the trap. I do think it's important to talk about the trap. Speeding up cash collection, right? So we've seen this. People get all excited about this. They go and they implement a whole bunch of these things. And they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. We're getting all this cash up front. They're getting bigger deposits. They're getting paid faster. They're moving milestones. They're getting all this cash coming in. And again, what starts to happen is if they're looking at their business on a cash basis, they're like, wow, we are so much more profitable. Careful. Chances are you're not more profitable. In some cases, you might even be less profitable if you've, for example, used invoice factoring or giving your clients a 10% discount to pay you quicker. right? And so this trap is it can create the illusion of profitability because you're collecting more cash. Therefore, on a cash basis, on a monthly basis, you might have lots more free cash flow being developed. But on an accrual lens, nothing may have changed. In fact, you might be worse off. So this is the fix is if you're going to start trying to pull cash forward, make sure that you have proper accrual accounting in place and revenue recognition so that you understand the difference between the cash that's in my bank account and how much of that is actually mine that we have earned because we did the work that we got paid for. Because otherwise, what you end up with is the situation that you talked about earlier, where you might have a whole bunch of cash in your bank account, and then you have a drought. There's not any work coming in, and then their cash runs out, and you realize like we still have a bunch of work to do, and all these people need to get paid, but the cash is gone because we weren't fundamentally profitable. So that's the trap with pulling cash forward that you want to avoid.
Yeah, and we talked about that on a previous podcast too, where that stuff shows up as liabilities on your balance sheet, and you have to pay it off at some point. It's not the same as owing money, but you owe work, and that costs you money. So yeah, it all catches up to you eventually. All right,
100%.
Number 2, what's on the spending side?
So number 2, so we talked about speeding up cash collection. That's the first main anchor to improving your cash flow. The second piece is delaying or spreading out expenditures, right? So how can you have less cash leaving the business so that you don't need as much cash coming in to not run out of cash? And so there are a whole bunch of different ways to look at this. One of the first ones that's often overlooked is flexible labor, right? So if you have flexible labor today, or if you don't have flexible labor today, consider getting some flexible labor. And then consider trying to tie the flexible labor's payment terms to the payment terms that you are subject to. So I remember with one of these clients that we were working with that was suffering with their most profitable work having the worst cash flow. This was one of the big unlocks for them, where they were subcontracting a lot of people on that work, and they were contractors. And that was like a massive light bulb moment for them. I was like, well, why don't you just get them on the same payment terms that you're on, so that you don't have to pay for 4 months worth of labor before you get your first month payment, and then you're always behind? Because that's the sort of math that you have to do with this. Is in her case, it was like, these were big projects, like 10, 20 grand a month worth of labor cost. And so when you think about that, it's like, well, if you're on net 120 payment terms and it's $20,000 a month to service this client, then you have to do 20,000 multiplied by 4. So that's $80,000. You have to tie up $80,000 worth of cash to work on this project. That's like the down payment on the real estate, if you will. That's what it's not that it's costing you that to do the project, but that's the amount of cash that you need to have available to work on that without running out of cash. Right? So like that's crazy. And so it was like, okay, how do you decrease that number? And part of it was, okay, well, could we get them on net 60 or net 90 payment terms for the contractors? And then the number of months of cash that I need to tie up to work with this client decreases. Because otherwise their thought was, well, we should do this other work that has better cash flow, but was way less profitable. And I was like, well, first, why don't we talk about how we can improve the cash flow of the thing that's actually profitable? Because ultimately, in the long run, that will be better for you. So flexible labor, that's a big one. The second one is thinking about barters or trades. This one's a little bit nuanced, right? But it's like, are there any of your vendors that you're paying in cash that if you're going through a particularly rough patch, you could offer to do services for them instead, to either reduce the amount of cash that you need to pay for them, or maybe remove the amount of cash that you need to pay them altogether. And this is especially good, I think, if you have excess capacity for a period of time. The next thing is moving towards variable cost models. So is there a way that you can take something that you would usually pay upfront for and go to a cost or a usage only based model? So this would be like switching from annual to monthly payments, or switching from monthly payments to pay-per-use payments. Of course, the other thing here is like, can you move to just buying smaller amounts of things if you're talking about like materials, leasing versus buying if you have hard costs or equipment or real estate, things that you need to be thinking about. Of course, tax efficiency and tax planning could be a big lever here. There may be some ways that you can accelerate depreciation on things to get big tax refunds, to pay less tax, to be able to basically pull from your tax reserves to deal with some cash flow challenges. The last two here are get access to revolving debt and credit. This is more on sort of the cash reserve side, which we'll talk about in a bit. But this is basically where you're giving yourself a little bit of room to absorb peak demand, right? So if you have these unusual months where, I don't know, there's 3 payrolls and your annual property taxes are due and you have to give bonuses out to the team and you're like, all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, I need like 80 grand more than I usually need in a month of cash. That's where some short-term lines of credit, revolving credit can be helpful to just help you manage that massive spike. And the last one is refinancing debt. So if you have taken on a bunch of debt in the past, either to acquire the business or, during COVID or whatever the case might be, and that debt is at pretty bad interest rates, you would be surprised at how much a refinancing can make a difference in your cash flow. And there's 2 particular things to pay attention to. Obviously, the interest rate. If you can get a lower interest rate, that's very helpful. So for example, like if you had a line of credit and you used it and it was only supposed to be for a short time, but then you lost your biggest client the following month, and now you've been carrying a balance on that line of credit for 3 years and you're paying, 14% APR on that line of credit. Well, you could probably get that merged into a small business loan at closer to 7% at the time that you're listening to this podcast. That would cut your interest in half. That would significantly improve the amortization schedule on that. And ultimately, like, your payments would be a lot lower every month, significantly lower. The other thing that you can do is think about kicking the amortization schedule out. So if you have a loan that was going to get paid in 5 years and you can renegotiate it at a lower interest rate and pay it off in a longer amount of time, that could also significantly reduce the payments. So while you might end up paying more interest in the long term, if your focus is on cash flow right now, that could really help decrease the amount of cash that leaves the business and still give you the option, hopefully, depending on the structure of the loan, to pay it off faster when your cash flow starts to recover. So you end up actually not having to pay more interest. So if you do have a high debt load that's putting a lot of strain on your business, I would encourage you to think about refinancing, especially right now where interest rates are starting to come down. It's a good time to go shop that debt. So those are my delaying expenditures things. Go ahead, Carson.
Oh, one of the things you mentioned around the line of credit, revolving credit being a positive thing until it's not, because a lot of times when I'm looking at agencies' books, it's like, oh, there's this huge line of credit that's been sitting here forever, and you keep on paying interest on it. So you get into that trap too. So yeah, there's always a danger. And speaking of traps, I know you have one around this one as well.
I do. And that is basically the trap, is that a lot of these things that I've just talked about, they can conserve cash now, but often cost more cash later, right? So this is the cost of poor cash flow. It is the unforgiving thing about, how our society works, and this capitalist system is generally, the worse off you are from a cash perspective, the more expensive it is to buy things and to get cash. So just be careful as you do these things that they're not basically degrading the fundamental unit economics of your business to the point where you can never recover. And this is especially true about credit, revolving credit. That is meant to be used on a very short time horizon. And if at any point you start to get to a place where, like, I'm going to be carrying a credit card balance for a long time, or I'm going to be carrying a line of credit balance for a long time, that's when you definitely want to be thinking about, can we get this refinanced into a more interest efficient vehicle? And the other thing to keep in mind here is that the best time to apply for credit and get access to credit is when you don't need it. You're right. So this is, again, part of like the spiral, is like, you're not going to get a good interest rate when your business is not in a good place. You're going to get a worse interest rate. And so it's like you get punished for being disadvantaged economically in North America. That's just how our system works. So if you want to go looking for money, do it when you are economically advantaged. And the fix for this trap is ensure that you understand your underlying unit economics. So that's your AGI versus revenue, your delivery margin as a business, what your direct delivery margins look like on projects, what your EBITDA and operating profit looks like, and make sure that they are good enough to absorb some of the increases in costs that you might experience from pursuing some of these short-term cash, cash strategies. One last thing that I don't think I mentioned explicitly, but should be obvious, is if you can negotiate better payment terms with your vendors, right? So if you pay somebody on a net 30 and you can get them to a net 60 or net 90, that's of course like the first thing to do. I think it's so obvious that it goes without mentioning, but I should mention it since we're trying to be comprehensive here. Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
We've done speed up cash collection, we've done delay or spread expenditures, and now we want to talk about cash reserves.
Yeah. So the fundamentals of improving cash flow are speed up cash collection and delay or spread expenditures. And then the other thing that is like something that you can just do in advance or while you're recovering from a poor cash flow situation is increase the amount of cash that you have or have access to, so that basically you can handle larger fluctuations in cash and they don't become a problem for the business. So this is kind of the idea of like, the bigger your tires are, the larger the bump in the road before it starts to matter to you. So it's like, okay, well, can we put bigger tires on this vehicle? And to go back to the grid example, it's like, well, if you can make the whole grid bigger, then it doesn't matter as much what the peaks are because the grid is operating at a smaller percentage of its capacity. So increase your cash reserves is obviously a good thing to do. So the fundamental thing with that is you got to increase your profitability or make sure that you have strong enough profitability to generate cash flow from your operations. You want to be thinking about distribution discipline. So in particular, if the business had a really good year and you took some really good distributions, and then you've sort of been continuing to take those same distributions, even though maybe the business isn't doing as well as it has in the past, then there might be time to reset how distributions are being taken out of the business for owners and trying to have a little bit more discipline in terms of like replenishing cash reserves before you go back to taking those same kind of distributions. You want to plan for slowdowns, right? So like, especially if you have a very seasonal business or you have time off policies such that like, that August and December are just going to be brutal months in terms of earning revenue. You want to plan for that, right? Make sure that that's reflected in your cash strategy and maybe your distribution strategy. Make sure that you increase access to credit when you are in a good place. And again, this can give you that overflow capacity that helps you handle peaks in the grid, if you will. And if you need to, consider doing a shareholder's loan to put money back into the business if you need to. And sometimes that makes sense from a from a tax perspective, depending on your structure. Like it might make sense to take the distribution and then put it back into the business as a loan so you don't pay tax on it twice. I get that, right? But in some cases, you might have to consider doing a shareholder's loan just to get the business to where it needs to be from a cash perspective. And generally speaking, the benchmarks around cash are going to be 3 to 6-ish months of operating expenses and between 2 and 4 payrolls in an operating account. So your 3 to 6 months is your reserve, and then you have your operating accounts. That's generally the rule of thumb for like how much cash is enough cash. And then your target might be higher than that if you want to do M&A, if you have like super high seasonality, if you have, a bunch of big investments or expenses coming up. So you're going to have to titrate that for yourself. But those are sort of the ideas around increasing cash. But it all starts with making sure the fundamental profitability of the business is sound. And we're going to close in sort of summarizing the benchmarks around both of those sides of things and metrics you can use. Now, the trap to keep in mind with all of this is if the tires are really big, then you don't feel the bumps, and the bumps might be getting bigger, and you might be on this path to having cash flow problems, but you don't see it coming because you have so much cash that you don't need to pay attention to it. So the long and short of this is a big cash reserve can create some complacency, and it can sort of mask the emergence of a cash flow or a profitability problem because you just have so much cash that you're not really having the discipline to pay attention to these things. So the fix here is make sure that you have a strong cash and a strong accrual lens on your business, that you're regularly paying attention to the sort of vital indicators of health in both of those areas, which we're going to talk about. And then you should know that you have a problem, even if your cash reserve seems fine in a given moment in time, you'll see the problems coming and hopefully be able to prevent them before they cause an issue.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things you mentioned there was around slowdowns, seasonality, that sort of thing. I see so often agencies where they're stressing about Christmas break. It's like, well, Christmas break is coming. Let's plan for that back in February. Doesn't always seem to happen. And yeah, totally correct on the idea of these things hiding it. I see it all the time where when a company is in a really good cash position, they're not paying attention to the sort of profit or the unit economics that we like to work in, because they don't feel like it's a priority for them. But it's always underlying. It's always going to come back to you at some point, and you do need to pay attention to them. And I think that's what you want to talk about now.
Yeah. So I want to separate this into like metrics that you can pay attention to for both the sort of profitability side of the business and the accrual lens on the business, and then cash flow. So I'm going to start with the things that we always talk about, which is like what should be true about the business always at a fundamental level, which is you should have a delivery margin as a business of ideally above 50%, 50 to 60% plus. If you don't know what that means, then download the toolkit. We don't have time to get into it today, but we talked about it a billion times. Your direct delivery margin, this is at the project level, should be between 65, 75% or more per project, depending on your business, but that's the general rule. Your operating margin should be, the industry average is probably in the 10 to 15% range. We want to see that at 20% or more. Ideally, you're up closer to 30% if you're like really killing it. And your overhead should be 20 to 30% of your agency gross income. Less than that, you're either running super lean or you're under investing. More than that, you're either bloated from an overhead perspective or you're doing that on purpose to try to grow faster or what have you. You're making investments. And then your operational indicators would be your average billable rate is, 3 times your average cost per hour. So that correlates to roughly your 70% direct delivery margin or more. Your utilization rate, generally as a firm, 50 to 60% agency-wide, 65 to 80% on a weekly basis, depending on your team mix and PTO policy, and your average cost per hour, which is the inverse of what we talked about earlier. So less than 30% of your average billable rate is roughly the benchmark. So those things should just like always be true, because that tells you like, okay, our business is fundamentally profitable. And these are all based on an accrual lens of your business, both in terms of revenue and cost recognition. If you don't know what that means, I will leave a link to thing in the show notes that you can go watch and learn more about that. Now let's talk about cash flow, which again, like all of those things could be true and you might still have cash flow problems. So what are the indicators of healthy cash flow? Well, the first is your cash reserve. So again, benchmark there is 3 to 6 months of operating expenses in a reserve, 2 to 4 payrolls in an operating account. That's generally where you want to land from a cash perspective. Operating cash flow, this is paying attention to essentially like how much free cash is the business generating every month. And when you widen this or look at like a trailing 3 or 6 month average, generally you want more than 50% of your EBITDA to be resulting in free cash that you can reserve, that you can take as distributions, that you can actually use. If less than 50% of your EBITDA is showing up as cash on a regular basis, that's generally a sign that there's an issue that you need to be resolving there. 60 to 70% is good. More than 70% is great. Receivables, right? So how long does it take you to get paid? Generally, 30 to 45 days is pretty good. If you can get it under 30 days, that's really good. Over 60 days on average, then you're getting into a more challenging scenario, not unresolvable. But really important to be running accounts receivable aging reports and tracking like what is the average time to get a receivable collected, and is that going up or is it going down or is it staying stable? Then you have accounts payable. So it's the inverse. How long do you usually take to pay an invoice? 30 to 45 days is typical. Longer can be a good indicator if you're trying to improve cash flow, but it can also create float risk, especially if you're not doing a good job of managing that and keeping track of all your liabilities, right? So these things end up on the balance sheet as accounts payable. So if that gets out of hand, it could be a bad thing. Then you have CAC payback, or customer acquisition cost payback time, or cash conversion cycle. So this one's interesting. We don't talk about this one a lot, but it is important. How long does it take you to recover your investment in acquiring customers? This is like a super important metric if you're trying to grow while preserving cash flow. So basically the idea here is like, if it costs you $10,000 to get a client, how many months does it take you to make that $10,000 back in delivery margin or in gross margin? And if it takes you more than 90 days, that's not great, right? It's probably going to take a lot of cash for you to grow. And the longer this is, it's the same thing as the client where you have to float the cost of the team. If you want to grow at a certain rate, you have to tie up the amount of customer acquisition cost that it takes for you to grow at the rate that you want to grow for the number of months that it takes for you to recover it. So let's say you want to grow at 5 clients a month and it costs you 10 grand a month to get a client. That's $50,000 a month in cash you need to tie up in sales and marketing. If you're at 90 days to pay that back, you need $150,000 of cash tied up in sales and marketing to grow at that rate. You also need to spend $150,000 before you make $1 back. It's also scarier. Whereas if it's at 60 days, that's pretty good, right? And now you only need 100 grand. If it's at 30 days, that's great. Now you only need 50 grand, but it is possible to get this to zero or negative zero, meaning you make a profit on your client the moment that they sign with you because the first check that they give you is more than it costs you to get them in the first place. That's the holy grail if you can get there. So definitely if you're in a growth mode, definitely be paying attention to your cash conversion cycle on acquisition. It can make a big difference. Last couple of things here around cash flow, debt service ratio. So if you do have debt, you want to make sure that your operating cash flow divided by your debt obligation is at least 1.25. 1.5 to 2 is generally where you want to land. More than 2, you're doing great. So you have more than enough cash to service all your debt. You shouldn't have a problem there. You might even want to consider paying it off quicker if some of them have high interest costs. Line of credit utilization, you generally want to keep this to under 25 to 50%. More than that, probably not a good thing. And you want to be on track to pay that off within 3 to 12 months most of the time. And if you know that you're not going to be able to pay it off within 12 months and you want to try to look at consolidating that debt into a lower interest vehicle that is longer term so that you can manage your interest and your payment expenses. So those are some sort of metrics that you can pay attention to around cash flow that are separate from the fundamental profitability of the business. So there, mic drop. That's everything you need to know about cash flow.
And if you're listening to this, so you're sitting in your car, you're listening to this at 2 times speed.
I'm so sorry.
It probably took a lot to. I think we need to create a cheat sheet of this to have available for people. So it's something we can work on after.
Yeah, I've got all this mapped out in Miro. So yeah, maybe we will make this a cheat sheet and like check the show notes, and we'll have a link to something there that you can click on. And we'll probably ask you for your email so we can send you marketing. But in exchange, you will get everything that I talked about nicely documented here in a PDF.
Yeah. And I mean, there's just so much of this that people have to think about. And I mean, I've owned an agency before, and the idea of even stopping to consider half of this stuff would have blown my mind. So I guess the pitch at the end is like, if you need help with this, give us a call.
Yeah. Yes. That's a great plug. And interestingly, depending on when you're listening to this is a bit of an Easter egg, but like our client relationships are evolving to take all of this stuff on. So the idea is you don't have to think about all of this because we're doing all this thinking for you. And we're paying attention to cash flow and profitability and making sure that both are healthy and evaluating the relationship between the two of them. And the more cash flow and accounting and bookkeeping side of that is something that is emerging for us. So if you're listening to this and you're like, wow, I would really love to have Parakeeto handling both profitability and all the other finance stuff, then send us a message and you could be one of the people to experience that as it's coming to light. Because we are sort of managing demand for that right now as we build that capacity internally to do that finance stuff. So
yeah, and I mean, and as a consultant, it's super exciting because I think I still firmly believe that the profitability side of things is the most vital part to be looking at, but there are other pieces to this puzzle, and it's exciting for us to be able to put them all together holistically and helping agencies sort of at a different level. So
yeah. Agreed. We can do a better job. And I think for clients too, they can just sort of worry about fewer things and know that we have a very holistic and trusted approach to taking care of all this stuff for them. So with all of that, yeah, do reach out, find me on LinkedIn, send us an email, fill out the form on the website, and check the show notes for more resources if you want to go deeper on this cash flow and profitability stuff.
All right. Thanks, Marcel. That was awesome.
Thank you, Carson. A real pleasure. And I'll see you the next time that we do this.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.